Greetings and salutations all, I.S. Anderson here once again with another Mythology Time. And for today's Mythology Time we're going to go back into Greek mythology. We're going to be talking about a subject that I've been studying for quite a long time. It's actually one of the very first I got into when I first got into mythology. Only we're going to be talking about a very specific aspect of it. We're going to be talking about the monster of that series. And get into a deep discussion of whether or not she was actually a monster or maybe she was merely a victim of the gods and their plights and just getting caught in the crossfire between gods and mortals. I'm talking specifically about the Gorgon Medusa. Now, I've been studying this particular story for a very long time, and to say that it's open to interpretation would be an understatement to say the least. There's basically only three consistencies that I've seen through every rendition of the story I've seen. Medusa was a Gorgon, which is a woman with snakes for hair. She could turn people to stone with a mere look, and she died at the hands of the hero Perseus. Now, if you want an example of just how complicated Medusa is, you can just look at you can just Google her on the internet and just take a look at the images of her. I mean, there's depictions of her imaging from the completely effeminate and sexy to the truly monstrous, and a whole lot of stuff in between. Now first, just a little background history on Medusa. She was actually the daughter of two primordial sea deities named Phorcus and Keto. Now there's not too much information out there about Phorcus and Keto, other than besides being ancient sea deities, they were sort of primordial, kind of titans if you were. They were also the parents of Echidna, the mother of a lot of the monsters, namely, like the Hydra and the Nemean lion and Cerberus himself. Medusa also had two sisters, Cethano and Euryale. And unlike Medusa, her two sisters were immortal, although all three of them could actually turn men into stone just by their gaze. Now, all this information thus far, we didn't really have written down anywhere. These are mostly interpretations from Greek art off vases from ancient Greece, and they were always, all three sisters of Medusa were always depicted as monstrous in nature. A lot of people say that they were supposed to be a physical personification of death because of the wide eyes and the mouth being open and all that. So that's one theory I have. It isn't until Roman times that we actually get a Roman poet named Ovid, O-V-I-D, who actually has the first written account of the story of Medusa. And it's actually the story of Perseus, and he just throws her in as the monster. But he is the first one to give her the background story of being a beautiful mortal woman at first and then turned into a monster by Athena. Now what you have to keep in mind is that these stories come from a long time ago, long before we had computers, word processing, could store stories on hard drives and things like that. I mean, this is pretty much a long time before everybody was taught how to read and write even. A lot of people didn't know how to read and write, and stories were not, written down. They were passed by word of mouth. So by the time this story was finally written down, it wasn't until the Romans took over the Greeks and took over their, essentially took over their religion, that the story got written down. So that's why there's more than one interpretation of this story. Now the first version of the story, or the kid-friendly version as I like to call it, is basically another tale of, don't be too vain, don't be into vanity. Medusa was a beautiful woman who bragged about her beauty and compared her beauty to that of the goddess Athena, which is something you did not do. So Athena confronted Medusa about all these braggings that she did. And she basically told Medusa, well, even if that was true, it's only beauty. What good is beauty doing to the world? And Medusa said, well, my beauty brings joy to a lot of other people. And Athena replies with, well, other people are learning and doing things. All you're doing is being beautiful and trading off your looks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it away from you. And that's when Athena curses her with the snakes in their hair and makes her so monstrous that she turns people into stone. And the reason I call that the kid-friendly version is because that's the version of the story that gets passed off in a lot of children's stories. But as you grow into adulthood, you start to learn of slightly more darker tales. Now, I like the movie Clash of the Titans, or at least I like the original one a lot, but they completely got the story wrong. I mean, Eamon was saying that the story was that Medusa had sex with Poseidon in the temple of Aphrodite, and Aphrodite got jealous and cursed her, which would never happen. A, that's what you did in temples of Aphrodite. They were pretty much brothels, so Aphrodite expected you to do that. B, there's no way Aphrodite would get jealous over what Poseidon does, so there's no way that would happen. Now, the more common and logical version of that story was that Medusa did have sex with Poseidon, but she had the sex in the temple of Athena. And Medusa was usually a priestess of Athena, which was a double whammy against her. Athena interpreted this act as a defilement, and plus she didn't really like Poseidon in the first place. You know, there was a whole thing with her and Poseidon supposed to be the patron goddess of Athens. Athena took it. And so Poseidon and Athena were pretty hard rivals ever since. But since she saw Medusa having sex with Poseidon as a defilement in her temple, she couldn't really punish Poseidon, so she punished Medusa. Then we come to the third, most modern and darkest interpretation of the story. Poseidon was actually unsuccessful in his attempts to seduce Medusa within Athena's temple, so therefore he raped her. And Athena saw this again as a defilement and blamed Medusa for it, and therefore cursed Medusa. So with those three different interpretations of the same story, that leads us to the question, was Medusa a monster, or was she a victim? Now, in order to really answer that question, you have to not only look at Medusa's story and all the evolution it took, but you've got to look at other stories. I'd like to bring up Beowulf for just one moment, specifically the monster in that story, Grendel. Now, when you take a look at the story of Beowulf, there really wasn't that much development to the character of Grendel. He was basically just an asshole that went too far when he told the neighbors to keep it down. As time went on, though, Grendel actually got his own story, and we heard the whole tale from his point of view. And the Danes were pretty much just as much assholes as he was, at least in his mind. And when Beowulf killed him, you could almost say that he was a victim in his own rights. When a story first comes out, we don't really care so much what the villain's motivation is. All we want to see is the hero be triumphant and defeat them. But as time goes on and we get more used to the stories, we start to think, geez, why was the villain trying to eat those children? These days, we want our villains to be more complicated. We want them to be two-sided. We want them to not just be completely evil, but actually have some sort of redeeming qualities to them. A lot of people like to see heroes redeemed, or at least justified in some way. Originally, Medusa was just a monster. She was just one of 3 Gorgon sisters with snakes in her hair and a scaled body that could turn men into stone with the mere look at her. Even in her most monstrous depictions, though, there is some form of humanity buried deep beneath the snakes and the scales, which allows us to empathize with her. Medusa wasn't a monster that went out and ravaged the countryside or burned down the fields or anything like that. She just held her up in her temple wanting to be left alone. And when she finally is killed, it's not really because of anything she did. And when you take all these things under consideration, it's not difficult to see how she could eventually be portrayed as a victim rather than a monster or a villain. Of course, you could also make the argument that she never really did anything to redeem herself either. Now, whether or not Medusa is a true monster or an actual victim really comes down to a matter of individual choice. However, the one thing we can agree on is that her image has been burned into our selected consciousness since ever before her story came out, and probably will be there for a long time to come. So I hope you enjoyed this latest Mythology Time on Medusa. I will leave all my pertinent contact information down there below in the abyss as always. Please remember to comment, rate, subscribe, you know the drill. And until next time, this is I.S. Anderson saying, everybody, make your lives grand and have a good day. Thank you very much. And remember, kids, when having sex with deities, it's smarter to have sex in the temple of the goddess of love rather than the goddess of wisdom. Bad things can happen if you do it the other way around.